Good evening, everyone. Good evening also to the people in the Vimeo live stream, who tonight even outnumber the live audience here in the Kai Studios. I am Runa Nuitens, the coordinator of VUB Crosstalks, and this fall I have had the pleasure to program this series of More Than Human Encounters together with 4 fantastic people. Josie Vervloesem, with whom we presented the evening on radical botany, Olave Nduvanje, who interviewed Merlin Sheldrake, Maria-Elena Maruda, with whom we will be organizing 3 events on hydrofeminism in January next year, and last but not least, Mihnea Tanasescu, who is the curator of tonight's program. When I contacted Mihnea and asked him to think about a program for tonight, it didn't take him too much time to come up with the names of Marisol and Isabelle. Much to my delight, I must say, because when you will go and have a look at the Crosstalks website and go and see the vision text that we wrote, we end with a quote from Isabelle Stengers and Ilya Prigozhin. And I will read it because it really summarizes. It's still a very. It summarizes what this series of More Than Human Encounters is about. Today, we no longer have the right to pretend that we command a unique position from which we can view the truth about the world. We must learn not to judge different areas of knowledge, culture, or art, but to combine them and to establish new ways of coexistence with those who enable us to meet the unique demands of our time. And although this quote dates from 1984, so the today in this quote is already 30 years old or even more, it's still very relevant, I think. But back to Mihnea Tanasescu. Mihnea is a political ecologist working in the political science department of the VUB, the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. And he has worked on the political and legal representation of natural entities, on the politics of environmental catastrophe, and on nature conservation, restoration, and rewilding in Europe. And earlier this year, Mihnea, when I contacted him, he was still busy writing 2 books, which I've understood in the meantime have also received titles. One is Understanding the Rights of Nature, a Critical Introduction, and the other is Ecocene Politics. Before giving my place to Mihnea, I would also like to say that there's a possibility to ask questions or leave comments in the Q&A or the chat of the Vimeo, but we will only come to these questions and answer them around 9 o'clock when this discussion is opened to everyone. So have a nice evening, and then we'll switch places with Mihnea. Thank you.
Hello, Marisol. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Hudale, for a wonderful introduction. It's true, it took me less time to come up with the theme of tonight and with titles for the books. So, welcome everyone on Vimeo here. It's nice to see a full room. It's absolutely delightful. Welcome to this 3rd installment of the More Than Human Encounters series. I'm, of course, tremendously happy and honored to be here discussing a topic that's very dear to me in the company of 2 people, Marisol de la Cadena and Isabelle Stengers, that I deeply admire and that I have learned a lot from. The discussion tonight was announced revolving around the notion of personhood and what may or may not count, what the notion does, what it hides, what it calls upon, whether it may or may not be complicit with power, with violence, with assimilation, or with homogenization. A good place to start in order to introduce a bit the general context of this evening is with the title itself. How large is a person? The title is, in a way, a bad one. Or rather, it was meant as a provocation and as a trap. What did we think of? What did I think of when encountering it? At least part of what came to my mind was a singular person, one modeled on an imaginary being, most certainly human, even then a certain kind of human. In any case, a human that cannot be at the same time other than human, let alone a kind of thing. That very suggestion seems to our ears offensive, being a thing. Asking how large a person is begs for this kind of interpretation. And it does so because it preys on a habit of mind that has become almost irresistible. The simplification of concepts by their assimilation to received wisdom, and therefore their ejection out of thought. But if I asked, how many persons are there? The same trap would have been laid. I think that in a way the trap was unavoidable, no matter what the title may have been, inasmuch as it contained the word person, and inasmuch as it was put in this setting, in the center of Brussels, a historical bastion of what we call modernity. So why does this title contain it nonetheless? One reason is to challenge the way in which our own thinking gives in to inherited conventions. The other, maybe more significant reason is that I felt compelled to use an already existing term, person, in order to open the door towards sabotage. This kind of intellectual sabotage can be accomplished either by proposing a neologism, so another word that tries to avoid the shortcomings of person, or else by seemingly embracing the term in order to twist its arm into becoming other, mutating, evolving in tandem with a changing of practices and thought, of practices of thought. This is why person is part of the title. Perhaps by courting it head-on, we can manage to subvert it into meaning much more than it has in the individualist history of the past several hundred years, on display in an extreme form today. Persona, where the term comes from, meant a mask, so something that hides or deceives, something that you can never be sure of, that can, almost must, surprise. So inside the idea of the person lies the possibility, opened up by the history of the word itself, of always being surprised, of never being able to count on what we think may be behind the mask. The person always confronts us with our own ignorance, and therefore asks that we form the habit of mind of always reconsidering. How large is a person? Well, perhaps large enough to be several, or perhaps it is always several, no matter how large or how small. Perhaps the idea of personhood can be thought of as a process without definite ends. It may be that becoming person is a movement, largely dependent on the lack of associations given in any particular situation. Perhaps becoming person is like the crest of a wave, a momentary concrescence that is a kind of optical illusion, but one without which the process of the wave would not be what it is. Who knows? The only thing I know is that there is much thought to be done in this area. This thought matters, it is perhaps urgent, because we live in times of massive decomposition, what Isabelle Stengers has called catastrophic times. To avoid the barbarism that she postulated as a potential consequence of catastrophe, it seems to me that we need to literally get out of our heads in order to ground our thinking in the environing world. Talking about personhood is just one way of doing that. To help in this process of getting out of our heads, we have two guests that have taught us much about how to do just that. Marisol de la Cadena is professor of anthropology and science and technology studied at the University of California, Davis. She will give the opening lecture tonight titled Runa, Human but Not Only. She is the author of many articles and books occasioned by her work with and within Andean philosophical traditions. Her book, Earth Beings, Ecologies of Practice Across Andean Worlds, offers her most comprehensive explanation of mutable traditions of practice and thought in what is present-day Peru. She has co-authored several edited volumes with Mario Blazer, increasingly exploring the role of critical anthropology as a resource for thinking the new ecological era that has undeniably begun. Marisol's work, though being rooted in anthropology and science and technology studies, is significant for many other fields, and I may even say for thinking in general. As I'm sure you all know, we no longer live in the relatively mild times of the Holocene, the geological era that has started about 14,000 years ago and that has ended, quite abruptly, with the advent of modernity and its model of development seeking continuous growth through consumption and production, what Bruno Latour has called total production, capital T, capital P. This era, the Anthropocene, or to my mind better yet, the Ecocene, the age of ecology, is the fundamental concern that thinking and doing must now constantly problematize. And Marisol's anthropological work has started to engage with the fundamental problems the Ecocene poses by drawing on a plurality of worlds, not just a multitude of perspectives on the same world. In this, she has joined a tradition of critical anthropology that is now indispensable. For example, her edited volume, A World of Many Worlds, explores how different worlds may or may not be in tension, in violent confrontation, in partial agreement, or in mutual beneficence. Her work raises the problem of how different beings can be known and what we may allow that knowledge to do with us and our political practices. So I'm therefore obviously very excited to be able to engage with this work tonight in dialogue with Isabelle Stengers, whose work I will briefly introduce after the initial lecture. So the evening will proceed as follows. First, Marisol will deliver the keynote lecture, which, as she has told me before this began, is complicated, which means that she will use some slides that will underline the key moments, as it were, and key conceptual conundrums that should make following it easier. After this talk, Isabelle and I will join her in a discussion of the ideas before us tonight. And then the floor will be opened up to the public in order to pose questions that may arise, both through the online chat and here in live. And afterwards, we will finish the evening on a different, non-discursive note with a performance by Mandrill Kin. But now let's turn our attention to you, Marisol.
Thank you, Mihnea, and thank you, Cadena, and thank you to all those involved in the More Than Human series. It is a pleasure to share the screen with one of my favorite witches, Isabelle Stengers. And it's already a pleasure to meet you, Mihnea. I will ask you for your email so that we can exchange ideas soon thereafter. So I am going to share my screen to start, and I hope technology cooperates. I don't know, Isabelle, if you will be able to see the screen that I'm sharing, because I see it's behind you, but is it in front of you as well? Okay.
We are both looking at the computer, so we're seeing you.
Okay, great. So I'll share my screen. Just a second. Before sharing. Can you see my screen now? Yeah. Okay. So the title in your screen, in my screen, has a word in Quechua. Can you see my cursor? The word in Quechua is Runa. And what that word means is gente in Spanish, after the backslash in English, gente in Spanish. In English, the best word I could come up with is people, but it actually, people is pueblo in Spanish, which is not gente. So there's no word in English that allows me to translate gente and let alone Runakuna. Runakuna is the plural of Runa, R-U-N-A. So what I'm going to talk about is how gente in the Andes are human, but not only. And this little phrase, not only, will prove very important to do something that Mihnea said, which is open doors, open concepts. And I want to tell you that it's very important for me to say that I think this phrase in the presence of two dear mentors, Mariano and Nazario Turpo, with whom I worked in the Andes for many years, more than 10 years, and who taught me that how I used to think was totally insufficient. And they opened the door to my struggle to think more, or actually to think. So I write these in the presence of Mariano and Nazario, Turpo, and the mountains and lagoons that surrounded us that are not such, that are not only such, sorry. And I write these with a tool that was given to me but by Isabelle Stengers, in the presence of opening up the dialogue to beyond what each of us, Mariano and Nazario, are, and more than the way in which each of us thinks. So I'm going to read because it's a difficult talk, and if I don't read, I won't be able to follow my thought. So I ask you to bear with me and my reading. I once told a customs agent who was quizzing me about the purpose of my presence in the UK that I was there to talk about mountains that were not only such. A bit taken aback, but also trying to show he understood, he added, sacred mountains. I responded cryptically, that too, but again, not only. He smirked, sealed my passport, and I left giggling silently. As inconspicuous if frequent phrase, I learned to use not only as an ethnographic conceptual tool in conversation with Mariano and Nazario Turpo. They would insist that what to me was, for example, a mountain, was not only that. And coming to terms with what was not only what to me was, in addition to taking a lot of time, required working at a permanent interface, a mutually inhabited relation where the Turpos' worldly practices and mine were both seemingly alike and at the same time different. And what emerged at that interface, rather than the entity or practice in question, was the awareness of our concepts and ways, the Turpos and mine, always exceeding each other as they also overlapped. Relationally, mutually other, and not only, relentlessly so. In what follows, I will offer you the explanation that I left the customs agent without. And although I go into the 16th century momentarily and in speculative mode, I promise to connect it back with the ethnographic moment when I thought, say, but not only. So on to the 16th century. It is impossible to take from them this superstition because the destruction of these huacas would require more force than that all of the people of Peru in order to move these stones and hills. This quote by Cristóbal de Albornoz belongs to the process I am calling the Anthroponaut scene, a condition of possibility for the Anthropocene I conceptualize the Anthroponaut scene as a world-making process by which heterogeneous worlds that did not make themselves through the division between humans and non-humans, nor necessarily conceived as such that different entities in their assemblages were both obliged into that distinction and exceeded it. The Anthroponaut scene was the process of destruction of these worlds and the impossibility of such destruction. It includes the practices and practitioners of the will that granted itself the power to eradicate all that disobeyed the mandates to be human as modernity in its early and late versions sanctioned, and the disobedient practitioners of collectives composed with entities recalcitrant to classification as either human or non-human. Initial obvious makers of the Anthropocene were people like Cristóbal de Albornoz, a friar well known after his activities to extirpate idolatries, one of the practices from which the New World emerged as inhabited by redeemable humans and nature, all God creations. Earth beings is my translation for wakas, the entities the Albornoz wanted to destroy. I met them as tiracuna. The word is composed of the Spanish tierra and its Quechua pluralization cuna. So tierras or earths would be a literal translation. Intriguingly, the Albornoz translated huacas as stones and hills and identified their enormousness as the cause of the difficulty to eradicate what he considered a relationship of false beliefs. The extirpator's surprise and anxiety did not end with the enormity of the idols, for he also found out that people, Runa Kuna, while different from huacas, were also in continuity with them and could even become one. I want us to take this surprise into consideration for the possibility of becoming huaca, translated by colonial friars and contemporary scholars as becoming rock, speaks of the divergence between Spanish and Andean Runa, Andean gente, Andean Runacuna. The difference between both, in spite their also apparent similarity. Bodies are the same. What they are might be different. The translation of Runacuna to Spanish is gente. You can look at the green highlight. So risking anachronism for the sake of a thought exercise something. In addition to replacing a spurious belief with legitimate ones, the 16th century practice of extirpating idolatries might have included displacing the relational possibility of Andean people, Runacuna, becoming with huacas, replacing that with a theological relational grammar that conceived of humans as distinct from nature. The friar's mission might have required making the human that conversion needed. And this human was not what the friars encountered, for Runacuna could become with Tiracuna, even become one. The colonial expansion denied humanity to its other. That is a usual assumption. But what if this were not only the case? The famous mid-16th century debate in Valladolid, let's remember, did not cast doubts about the humanity of New Worlders. The discussion was about the kind of humans Indians were and the kind of treatment that would best suit Spanish moral and economic interests as they converted them to Christianity. Neither of the two most prominent contenders, Sepúlveda or Las Casas, doubted Indians had souls. Rather, it was their having souls that made them potential preys of the devil. Defeating the danger required the eradication of Indians' idolatrous practices, including, of course, their becoming waka. They're becoming rock, as they would say. In what can be a retrospective insight, I have just said, and as he wraps up the order of things, Foucault writes, quote, taking a relatively short chronological sample within a restricted geographical area, European cultures since the 16th century, one can be certain that man is a recent invention within it. End of Foucault's quote. Agreeing and expanding Foucault's Europe to its recently conquered territories, my proposal is the emergence of man, capital M, might have implied a colonial imposition, not the denial of Christian humanity on Runakuna, that entailed extirpating not the idols alone, but with them forms of personhood that could be contiguous with wakas. Disobedient persons or humans whose continuity with stones was enabled by the devil were persecuted and condemned to jail, death, and hell. The practice, not surprisingly, coincided with a critical period of persecution of witches and werewolves in Europe, perhaps also Christian human-making practices. Befuddling the friars, the Andeans' disobedience, Runakuna with Tirakuna, that complex entity, continued, if also changing historically. Today, 500 years after Cristobal de Albornoz, Earth beings confront new eradicators. Mining corporations, agents of the Anthropocene, translate Tirakuna as mountains and a source of minerals and therefore wealth. Unlike their colonial counterparts, they have the power to remove mountains and redirect rivers or empty lakes. In an earlier work, I explained that protesting these extractive practices, Earth beings have broken into the public political scene as, quote, I'm quoting myself, contentious objects whose mode of presentation is not homogeneous with the ordinary mode of existence of the objects thereby identified, end of quote. Mountains are mountains emerging as Earth beings. Mountains emerge as contentious objects. They are not Earth beings, they are mountains. Punto. Earth beings as actors in the public sphere shock the onto-epistemic limits of politics. A scandalous presence, they need to be trivialized, mocked at. I stay faithful to what, however, today, I would also extend the being contentious to the Runakuna with whom Tirakuna are made public. They, Runakuna, are also not homogeneous with the ordinary mode of existence attributed to us humans. They are contentious to it. For in Ayu, they emerge inherently with Tirakuna. The Andean ethnographic record is replete with references to Ayu. The other reason why I use PowerPoint is because I use many words in Quechua, the spelling of which and the sound of it I need to offer you. The Andean ethnographic record is replete with references to Ayu, defined as the collective possession of land by a group of humans linked by kinship bonds. Obeying the grammar of conversion, Ayu here has three distinct actors: humans, land, and the relationship between them. Humans connects them. I say that Ayu is this institution and not only. Thinking with disobedient grammars, Ayu is also a relation through which Tirakuna, and Runakuna take place. That is, they become in time and space as a complex entity, a more than one decision, inherent to which is the relationship that enables them. So in this in this grammar, that's not the grammar of conversion. What I'm talking about is not humans and land linked by a relationship, but humans and land emerging together with a relationship inherently inherent to them. As Donna Haraway says, and this is why I make the remark, it's important what relations that think entities. The relation of conversion, this relation is not the same as the relation of Ayu. And therefore, when you think through this relation, you're thinking a different thing than when you think through this relation. And Donna takes this phrase from Marilyn Strathern, with whom she has been in conversation for a long time, 30 years, 40 years now. And now I want to say what I had not said in an earlier work. Runakuna are contentious because as they become with earth beings in the public political sphere, they are human and not only. Being inherently with earth beings, when they appear in politics, I'm talking modern politics, that's not only such, therefore. When they appear in politics, their composition is not only that of humans representing mountains. They make present the disobedience Christianity declared could not be, the anthroponaut seen, the human with that which the person so-called human could not be. I can imagine friars thinking, these people think they are rocks, as they would if they would witness today's demonstration. I am quoting here, and I'm quoting Donna Haraway. I firmly believe that we have never been human, let alone man. This is a phrase in the introduction to the Haraway Reader. It is also the title of the first section of that beautiful, wonderful book that's called When Species Meet. Others have discussed similar ideas. For example, in 2011, Dorian Sagan gave a talk at the AAA at the American Anthropological Association with the title, The Human is More Than Human. My title for this talk, Runa, Human but Not Only, is fellow traveler of those ideas. It bears similarities with Haraway's and Sagan's titles. Yet my purpose is also other. For example, the human that Sagan's work evokes is, like in the usual ethnographic definition of Ayu, the one that can be relationally separated from or brought together with the non-humans that he also evokes, that Sagan evokes. Runakuna and Tirakuna are not only this human and non-human. And I want to introduce a caveat to avoid misunderstanding. I'm not saying that Sagan or Haraway are wrong. My purpose is not to correct their statements. Rather, it is to contrast and genealogically connect the more than human or the non-humans of those titles with their excess. The disobedient Tirakuna with Runakuna, whose joint personhood is enabled in a way that geology and biology, the field sciences that Haraway and Sagan are mobilizing, the Runakuna and Tirakuna are together in a way that neither geology or biology can exhaust. You cannot think Runakuna and Tirakuna through geology or through biology. You can think them as mountains and humans, but not as not only such. I first thought human, but not only, when requested to write a comment to How Far Forests Think, Eduardo Kahn's very inspiring book. A passage in that book slowed down usual understandings of human and non-human. Runa, the people with whom he worked, understand human and non-human sociality as one and the same thing. Confirming my need to slow down was the condition worn by a Runa, a person that we would call a human, and that he would call himself or herself a human, could be with jaguar. The phrase is pumayo. The suffix in Quechua, "yu" means with. It's a human that is with a jaguar. So human that can be with jaguar. And vice versa, since jaguars could also be with human. So human with jaguar, a jaguar with human. We can think that as beliefs, but I don't want to. Okay, so he also wrote, were jaguars, Runa puma, or Runa persons are also dogs. And he called all these conditions transspecies pidgings, which I agree there are, but not only. I insist, because I repeat, it matters what concepts think concepts, and when worlds meet, species may open up to partial connections with entities whose relational becoming is not only as species, at least not in their biological version, no matter how complex this might be. Next to her sentence, to the sentence that I read before, Donna Haraway's sentence that I read before, she writes, in my view, people are human in at least one important sense. We are members of a biological species, Homo sapiens, and that put us solidly inside science, history, and nature, right at the heart of things. Tweaking Donna's phrase to my intentions may also open that sentence up to its excesses, to excesses of science, history, and nature, and thus to other than Homo sapiens ways of being people, or gente in Spanish. The indistinction between human and non-human sociality suggested by Pumayo, a human with puma, the composition Runacuna with jaguar, or in the story I tell, earth beings with Runacuna, may also suggest that those entities are not only human and non-human in their Christian or biological versions. Another example, Davi Kopenawa, famous Yanomami shaman and Brazilian politician, in his recent book writes, today, we are the same as those we give the name of game. Our inner part is identical to that of game. We only attribute to ourselves the name of human beings by pretending to be so. Animals consider us their fellow creatures who live in house, while they are people of the forest. This is what they say. Humans are the game that live in houses. These are neither isolated examples nor restricted to the Andes or Amazonia. Rane Villerslev, an ethnographer of Siberia, in an article suggestively titled Not Animal, Not Animal, explains that the Yukahir hunter, Yukahir is the group he worked with, and the Yukahir hunter, usually a man, seduces his would-be prey, let's say an elk, by becoming it, but becomes an elk incompletely to maintain sight of his own personhood and thus avoid becoming irreversibly the elk he is after. Once again, caveats. First, I'm not talking about a pan-indigenous human capacity to actually become animal. Rather, I rethink the relational condition that make those notions, human and animal, distinct, and the embodied grammar that those conditions enforce, to propose that while currently hegemonic, they were also created as part of a universal order that was obeyed, and not only. Second, the second caveat, and rather obvious, the Turpos, the Runa people that Kant worked with, the Siberian Yucca here, and Davi Kopenau are not saying or doing the same thing. Yet, they all disobey human, animal, plant taxonomic distinctions and exceed society thus made, they exceed the society made with those distinctions while also being part of it. And that's very important, while also being part of it. The human with Jaguar Pumayo, the hunter that needs to remember he's not the elk that would be his prey, or the human as the game that lives in houses, are both the we that has never been human because it has always been an inter or intra-species relationship, that it has always been the human that Donna and Sagan talk about, and not only that, we. It may be this capacity to exceed society, to be unoccupied by it while occupying it, even if at the margins, that makes Runa Kun and others like them effectively, that is politically promising. Impossible to society, yet dwelling within it and also beyond its limits, they are powerfully frightening, because if we accept the challenge to think in their presence, they can offer the possibility for what I call onto-epistemic openings. In a nutshell, what I mean by onto-epistemic openings, very quickly because there's no time for more, what I mean is undoing the closures that make the given to consider it a historical event, the given a historical event in Foucault's sense, and open possibilities for what might not be contained in or by that historically given, what might exceed it, while also being part of it. Not only the event human, mountain, animals as biology or biology, also their excesses. To talk about Runakuna as not only humans is disturbing. I always feel it. Anti-colonial anxieties haunts the idea and prevents further thought. Questioning the universality of nature to proceed with multi-nature, multinationalism, and provincialized non-humans is easier than proposing an analogous conceptual move for humanity that avoids multiculture. But in the spirit of the absolutely gargantuan task of decolonizing thought, I propose a question. Could the egalitarianism intimated in the unqualified equivalence between human and Runa, or other form of being, gente, person, also carry, could that unqualified egalitarianism also carry the legacy of a colonial vocation that granted itself universal power to offer the human safe haven, sacred in early modernity, and then also secular via universal rights, while banishing forms of personhood that this vocation could not recognize? The Anthroponoid is a way of talking of those forms of personhood, not the invisible, subaltern human. I'm not talking about that, but the disobedient compound person. With that, it could not be human, but not only. The Yucca here hunter that is not animal and not animal. The elk that is not only animals because it could also be the hunter. The Anthroponaut scene is a neologism that uses the opportunity of extractivist neoliberalism and the presence it has generated in Andean politics of unrecognizable beings to provincialize the human into an uncommon nature, while also reckoning with a history that makes both human and nature globally hegemonic. Not only, and also the Anthroponaut scene and uncommon in nature, or the uncommons, are fellow travelers of what Merlin Strathern called negativities. The mode of analysis she used to take into consideration the absence in Hegel, her Melanesian fieldwork site, of certain categories, and then use such categorical absence to affect her analysis. By creating, and I'm going to quote her, creating contrast within our own language. So Merlin uses negativities to think about that which Hegel talks about, that our own languages do not talk, and uses that to create spaces in our own languages to think. So, and that's the end of the quote. Absences, and I'm going to quote again, she says, create spaces that our analysis lacks and can be used to, in her words, quote again, stop ourselves thinking about the world in certain ways, in the way we think. Similarly, I use absences to affect our conceptual language. But I also wish to do something else, much more prosaic. My use of negativities, and particularly not only, wants to indicate that epistemic assertions make presences, for example, nature and culture, that may, and the conditional here is important, include the ontological denial, sometimes benevolent, yet always imperative, of what exceeds them. Onto epistemic assertions, let's say nature, I say nature, can make absent and impossible what does not fit in nature, while also creating room to tolerate those excesses. Once again, the historical moment is important. Nature and humans are not absent from IU. Yet in extractivist corporate territory, the imperative assertion of nature and humans by the state, the police, mining companies, makes impossible all that exceeds both nature and humans and the relation that separates them. In the best of cases, that excess is made tolerable as cultural belief, a reality of second order, usually ignored, but as of lately, also extirpated via its criminalization. I will give you an example of the assertive will of an ex-Peruvian president to make impossible what does not fit within nature. Exasperated in front of TV cameras, he yelled, "We have to defeat those absurd pantheistic ideologies that believe mountains are gods and the wind is God. To believe that means to return to those primitive forms of religiosity that say, do not touch that mountain because it's an apple, full of millenarian spirit or whatever. Okay, if we get there, we'd rather not do anything, not even mining." This was the ex-president of Peru, Alan Garcia, and I relish by showing his picture, and he's yelling like this. Yes, maybe I shouldn't. While speaking modern idioms that separate the sacred and the secular, the ex-president's words have an uncanny resonance with a 16th century extirpation of idolatries that the Albornoz, the friar that I introduced at the beginning of the talk, practiced. A difference that the colonial friar might be jealous of is that extractivist corporations can actually remove the object of superstition. Another difference, and this one the Albornoz might have not liked, is that current extirpators have non-indigenous opponents. Alan Garcia's infamous remarks prompted disagreement from leading leftist politicians in Peru, who accused the then president of racism and religious intolerance and defended the right of indigenous peoples to their spiritual beliefs. Yet, when these politicians joined the defense of what they called indigenous sacred mountains, the Runa living in the surroundings of the endangered earth beings hesitated to consider the relations with Tiracuna as religion. Were Tiracuna sacred mountains? The answer was uncertain. Maybe, perhaps not only. As you may now suspect, this was the moment I had in mind when I responded to that UK customs agent. Negative qualifiers at the site of denials, a negation of the negation, may work as an ethnographic tool to open possibility for the presence of what the imperative assertion of the given made either absent or impossible. What the Peruvian ex-president and his leftist opponent asserted as indigenous religion, that is a relation between supernature and humans, those that lived around the endangered earth beings enacted as indigenous religion, and not only. That is, not only as a relation between nature, supernature, and humans. This intervention, the intervention of Runa, even if hesitant and subordinate, disobeyed the petition that came along with the conversion of Tirakuna and Runakuna into mountains and humans, and presented the relation between them intolerantly as superstition or tolerantly as worship of sacred mountains. This disobedience is a worlding event, a political anthropistemic opening performing Runakuna with Tirakuna, and not only. For such composition is also humans and non-humans, humans and mountains. This is a complex assemblage. Each of the entities in its composition and the worlding practice that make them is more than just one of them, inseparably so. Dorian Sagan and Donna Haraway would say, perhaps, that in this assemblage, humans are more than humans and nature is more than nature. And Mariano Nazario would add, not only. Included in the assemblage are Tirakuna and Runakuna. Another caveat, earth beings, or the translation into sacred mountains, are not a requirement for the emergence of disobedient political relational processes where humans are not only such. In the northern Andes of Peru, a mining corporation wants to drain several lagoons to extract copper and gold. In exchange, they would build reservoirs that they would build reservoirs, they say. Organized as guardians of the lagoons, local people define the mine's intentions. Many have died in the process. Yet I have not heard of the presence of earth beings, not once. However, a relation of becoming with place may help think a situation that has been explained away as mere stubbornness, stubborn guardians of the lagoon that don't want to leave. They don't know what they're doing. An iconic guardian of the lagoons is a peasant woman whose plots her land, the corporate mining project wants to buy to fully legalize its access to the territories it plans to excavate. The woman, whose name is Maxima, refuses to sell, and probably for an amount of money she would otherwise never see in her lifetime. Countless times, the National Police Force hired by the mine has destroyed the family's crops, attacked her and her children, even her animal. Her responses, as I asked her how she could stand it, why did she stay? She said, how can I be if I'm not this? The words with or land is not uttered. Instead, feet are stumped, breaking apart clods of dry soil. This is who I am. How can I go? Like the guards of the mine, pull out my potato plants. They'll have to pull me out. Have you seen a potato plant pulling itself out? I cannot pull myself out. I will die. The word here is not uttered. Who I am. With my bones, I will be. Once again, here is not uttered, like I am now. Through the lens of modern politics, this woman can be portrayed as an environmentalist and thus an enemy or an ally, depending on who speaks. Both detractors and supporters use what I have been calling the grammar of conversion, albeit secularized. They separate maxima, the human, from land, the natural resource, and then link both through a relation, property or possession, legal or illegal. However, the refusal to sell may include another relation, one from where woman, land, lagoon, or plants, rocks, soils, animals, lagoons, human creeks, and canals become inherently together, an entanglement of entities needy of each other in such a way that pulled apart, they would become something else. Conceived through these relations, the refusal to sell may also imply the refusal of the grammar that conceives entities as individual bodies, units of nature or the environment, which these entities are not when part of each other. There are no earth beings in Maxima's refusal. Nevertheless, like earth beings with Runa, her impossible separation from place also enacts life called uncommon nature, an assemblage of entities intra-becoming with each other and refracting individuation in such a way that translating them into units would require the use of force, literally so. Uncommon nature simultaneously coincides with, differs from, and exceeds the object that the state, the mining corporation, and environmentalists translate into resources exploitable or to be defended. She stays because staying she is. The redundancy reveals the relation where both place and maxima emerge from, one where she is not subject of the land, which is not her object. Her response succeeds the logic of profit and gain, certainly, and also that of the environment and its defense. If she is an environmentalist, and I think she is not only such. When Maxima explains her being with the land in impossible detachment, their being together through with crops, rain, soil, animals, entities that make are the relation, this explanation I propose exceed the limits of the property concept, where she nevertheless meets the mind in confrontation. Of course, her words can be heard through a habitual object and subject grammar, but her silences, which I filled with words in brackets in the previous slide, also suggests that there's not only one grammar to her refusal to sell the land the mind wants. As a tool to perform ontopistemic openings, not only suggests that entities or even the order of things may also be other than what they are. It is not a formula that helps adding to a list. Rather, not only opens room for presences that could challenge what we know, the ways we know it, and even suggest our impossibility of knowing without such impossibility canceling those presences, because not only allows entity to both fold into and exceed each other. Like the sacred mountain and earth being, whose overlaps and intra-excesses make me think. Allowing for complex incommensurability, not only and the other negativities, uncommons, the anthropo not seen, inhabit the a-plural vocation of Strathern's partial connections, more than one but less than many. Yet not only, like Haraway's cyborg, also works to indicate that a relation can be an entity, the partial connection as entity, not only the coming together of two distinct entities, human and mountain, or Maxima and her land, also an entity that is not without the relation that makes it. Maxima as an intra-relational becoming with that exceeds nature and human because they become together. The guardians of the lagoon, or Ayu, as uncommon nature because it includes humans, which thus are not only such a monstrous emergence that challenges usual categories and opens life to possibilities beyond those categories while also remaining with them, imploding taxonomies and also being with them relentlessly, not only. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Not only that. Marisol, thank you so much for an incredibly rich talk. You were right. It is complicated and rich. but that's wonderful for discussion. We don't have an easy job here, Isabelle. But I'm joined here. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and also with Isabelle Stengers. And it's hard to introduce you, but I'll try. Isabelle Stengers is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and author of many books in philosophy of science and political philosophy concerned with the ecologies of practice that make science and politics function. She has started her intellectual development in the natural sciences, in chemistry to be precise, before moving into philosophy. But characterizing her work in relationship to philosophy of science primarily, I think mischaracterizes it in some ways. Already at the level of intellectual genealogy, there are multiple inheritances that have marked her work. In dialogue with the works of Whitehead, Deleuze and Guattari, Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway, among many others, she has written widely on the potential of speculative philosophy to formulate new matters of concern. Speculation, in a sense, as pragmatism. As she herself has often described her work, it is a philosophy of knowledge production, which of course includes science, but is certainly not limited to it. Marisol herself, as many others, in an article from 2010, shows how the work of Isabelle Stengers is helpful to many different fields, not least critical anthropology, and the important work of thinking through our changing condition in an era of loss and decomposition. What I have learned from this work is that thinking is not a matter of applying the right formula to a state of affairs. Rather, thinking is the refusal of the obvious, and to paraphrase her, the continual concern with how problems may be posed. This requires the slowing down of thinking itself, as she has proposed repeatedly. Unlearning fast habits of thought is not easy, but it is vital, and we also have to thank the work of our two guests tonight for reminding us to do so and showing us both how and why. So maybe a good place to start, and there's many potential doors into this material. Maybe we can start with the slowing down of thinking itself and sort of how that may be a condition for getting to know the multiple worlds that Marisol is talking about. So how do we slow down thinking, and what is that?
Well, I think that Marisol gave us very good cases and even her enterprise when she say challenging habits of thought, let's say, not in general, but in the presence of Mariano and Nazario, Turpo, let's say. This is slowing down in act. And those disobedient men have nicely shown her the way to slow her categories down. And now she relays it, and she has learned to slow our categories down. And even those of so impressive thinkers, Donna Haraway, for instance. Yes, not quite. You are right, but not quite. And she's ready to tell that to any impressive thinker if I do believe, and it will happen to me, but I would guess if she feel that in a way of speaking or describing, there is the possibility of, I would say, going anywhere, to communalize again, be it nature or man or whatever, but to be at home everywhere. And she told me, oh, yes, those categories tell you that you can describe this as a mountain, you can describe this as even as a modern human, but not quite, not quite, because more. And I was very interested by that when I already listened some interventions of you. I was there is this I think you share what Haraway loves in the new biology. We can say we never were individuals. But let's not go too quickly. Let's not, it's something which has transversal effects, but let's not think that we have understood now. And the not quite will insist to slowing us down each time we think, yes, now we understand. Now we have the good category to communalize again. It's better. So I would agree. To me, and I will. I mean, you learn to me other than humans, where I thought that more than humans was, well, the thing to. I would meet. And other than human make you stutter. While more than human, you are at ease with that. I would say I know I am enabled by many non-human, and many non-human make me think and all that. So I say I cannot be understood without them. But this is too general. We are all more than humans, yes, but what is an other than human? Not what is, but what happens when you introduce other than humans in thought? Then you have to slow down, because other is not, more is a better description. Other is a disquieting description. And maybe if I say I got some access with a concept I create together with practice, obligation. Obligation is something you cannot describe in general. What obliged me as a philosopher is not what obliged others. There are as many obligations as there are practices, and they cannot be enumerated. But I know that when I try to think as a philosopher, I am obliged, and I am grateful. And I think there is something which may be akin to something like something you can meet, but meeting, encountering it transforms you, and not adds to who you are.
Marisol, I see you nodding. You are muted, I think.
Okay, I'm nodding all the way through because Isabelle knows that she inspires me. And I also know the limits of her inspiration, precisely because I'm speaking in the presence of entities that she's not speaking in the presence of. So what I get from her, I always say I tweak what I get from Isabelle, or I tweak what I get from Donna, because they are amazingly inspiring and opening thought and challenging us to think, which I think is what we all share. The element, what I think that what we all share is this feeling of anxiety when we are not thinking, or when we interact with people that we think are not thinking. So how do we tell them you're not thinking? We tell them you're not thinking by proposing challenges. And so here, human, but not only. What do you do with that? How do you think that? That's exactly what Isabelle said. What does that do to your thought? And
Yes.
what does that do to your thought? Not only about human, but all the things that are interrelated that can change when you say human, but not only, or not only, not only, because there's always more. There's always more to what is. And that's something I learned from Mariano Nazario. And that's something, I learned from Mariano Nazario in a way in which Isabelle, I think, learned from being with scientists and philosophers as well, and mixing both together. So I think that what I'm saying is that learning and not knowing is the way to slow down thought. Not knowing. I mean, my first reaction when I try to think something is, I don't know. How do I not know? Because the temptation of knowing is what we inhabit, right? We always know. And even as I have read this paper that appears to be round and complete, I want to not know. I want to open it up. I want it to be a challenge. I want human, but not only to challenge the notion of human, yes, but also how we know. Not only the notion of human, but how we know. Anyway, so slowing down thought is something that I think Isabelle has given us, and that's one of the phrases that continues to inspire me from that beautiful, those 15 pages in which she summarizes 7 volumes, the Cosmopolitical Proposal. In that first sentence, how do we say something in a way that slows down thought and provokes us to think that what we know is insufficient, is the way I translate it. And also the word insufficient, questioning words, because insufficient may suggest that there's sufficiency, right? So maybe insufficient and not only, because it may also be sufficient and open up insufficiency to the dance with opening up sufficiency to not only. Anyway.
Yeah, what I find extremely interesting there in this idea of slowing down and the way that you show it with your work as well, and what you said is this idea that you don't do this in order to bolster yourself up, right? To finally find the category and now you know. So the not knowing is a constant project that I think depends on the feeling of discomfort that you mentioned, and that is a sense of an ethics of the slowing down of thought, is staying within that constant mode of feeling uncomfortable in your own process of learning. And also, and I think with the example of Maxima and also the Turpo family, this idea of groundedness, of a location that you think through. And in your work, the location is that particular area of the Andes. As you said, for you, Isabelle, it's scientists, is also philosophers. And I think also texts. The way that we interact with the written word is very often the location in which we root ourselves in order to destabilize our thinking, slow it down, and become, again, uncomfortable. And I think that all of that to me is implied in your not only in the idea of slowing down thinking, but I'm also wondering if, we don't want that to become an automatism either, right? Because that would be again coming to the to having a category, right? And now I know the gesture, as it were.
But I'm fearing a bit the connotation of uncomfortable with thinking is a pain, you know. I think that it makes us vulnerable to encounter. And to learn is to keep vulnerable to something which makes you think and not recognize. And I think it seems to me that we should try to maybe to better to describe. Indeed, you Marisol, you speak about categories and categories, nature, history, science, and all that, human, and to disobey them through the not quite. But I tend to wonder about their power, because there is a feeling of escaping when you can take seriously a lot of kind of experiences which were denied, not the Runa experience, but in our own life, to disobey. To disobey is a freedom. It may be painful for the consequence, but it's first of all fresh air, you know. So the power of those categories, to me, should not be something to accept. I think there are situations where, for instance, I would like to ask you, Runa are indeed under strong domination, first by the Christian invaders, and then by their own modernizing new occupants. They are
And even
under.
allies.
Sorry?
And even allies.
Allies, yes. Yes, so indeed, yes. So they are in a, I like to say they are in a state of occupation, like during the war we were in Europe, occupied country.
Yeah.
So they have to take into account those categories because they ruled their life from the dominating point of view.
Yeah.
But Copenhagen, is it disobedient? I think that since Amazonia is in the process of destruction, but he's speaking he would not say not quite, because he does not take seriously the category of the white man.
No, but you know what, Isabel?
Yeah.
It's the not only
Yeah.
is something that allows people to participate in politics. And not only, they participate in modern politics completely.
Exactly.
Mariano Mariano fought against the landowner in alliance with leftist politicians that thought they were Marxist. He did not have enough class consciousness, but he would eventually. And all he was talking about were superstitions. And he participated with them. He became allies with them because, and this is another contribution of yours to my work, because they had an interest in common that was not the same interest. And it was not only a divergent, recognizable interest by all parts, but it was an ontological divergence that the leftist politicians that were Mariano's allies could not recognize. Not recently, but 10 years ago, I participated in a demonstration in which they were defending the mountain that was also an earth being. And there was a discussion among Runa, how do we publicly say this? If we say earth beings, they are going to say stupid Indians and nobody's going to be with us. So let's say environment. Let's say we're defending the environment. And not only of course, the not only wasn't pronounced, the not only was a gift to me from Mariano and Nazario when they were teaching me how to think. I would say mountain or a spirit, not spirit, Marisol. Can you not see it? It's there, it's not spirit. Spirit is what you cannot see. Can you not see it? So I said, okay, what person? Mountain, yes, but not only. And then finally, you know what, Marisol, you're not going to get it. You're not going to. So just say earth being and don't pretend that you will know what that is. And that was a huge lesson. So the vulnerability is something that's hugely important. We modern knowers do not want to be vulnerable. And I honestly had a blast being vulnerable. I learned how to not know as an epistemic stance. I learned to really take the rug from security from underneath my feet and be vulnerable to circumstances. And so disobedience is along with obedience. In Copenagua's terms also, because he speaks Portuguese and not only. And the not only is crucially important because the not only is part of what makes him speak Portuguese the way in which he speaks Portuguese. Anyway, I think that becoming vulnerable is what I would say. I mean, and you became vulnerable to science. I became vulnerable to a situation in which there were no words. In your case, you became vulnerable for a situation in which there were many words. You could have just explained with the words that existed, with the relations that existed, and you then invented obligation. You feel obliged to your own thought, or the other one that I love, to inherit differently, reclaim, to inherit differently. So exposing oneself to vulnerability and finding vulnerability. Anyway, I'll leave it there. But one more thing. This is to say that and I went to Maxima to show that political urgency can be satisfied by slowing down. There is no way to think Maxima other than as an environmentalist or a stupid woman, period. And she was in danger. And she was holding this incomprehensible position. Why don't you accept $500,000? Because I am here. What does that mean? And it means in a relationship of political danger vis-a-vis a mine, a mining corporation, it means vis-a-vis police force. And this is a kind of very abstract thought that is completely empirical and grounded. I wouldn't say empirical, I would say grounded. Empirical is another word that I think we need to rethink because earth beings are not empirical. And Maxima being wetland perhaps is empirical, but I would want to continue thinking that. So this slowing down is required by the urgency of the times. The Anthropocene is the end of the world as we know it. As we know it, perhaps it's our opportunity to open up that we to a more complex we that is replete with excesses that we don't know. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I've spoken too much.
I think the politics of what you're talking about is really important, right? Because, as you said, they're occupied. And I think this was the condition of all colonized people, and it continues being the condition of all colonized people. And there's probably nobody that's more versed in diplomacy than they are, precisely because they've always had to deal with both learning the concepts of the colonizer and translating their own into that language, right? Which always sort of effaces the not only. And there's a moment in your thought that I think is really good for illustrating that, which is the well-meaning egalitarianism of the left, right? Really perpetuating this idea that Indians have very nice beliefs, right? That we can try to understand, and actually we can understand, right? And we can take on board, but is not destabilized at all, right? This excess that is ontological doesn't come into the progressive politics that we now want to have in order to sort of make peace, right, with the colonized people and give them space. And it's interesting how this giving of space is always on the terms of the colonizer. And there's many examples of that. Yeah, but I'm wondering how you think that there's, and for both of you, what is the possibility of a politics that goes beyond this kind of multiculturalism? And at least the thing that comes to my mind is that we need to get out of the idea that politics is getting along together. Politics is agonistic, and we can contemplate what nobody contemplates, which is radical separation as well. Right? And I have a little anecdote there in New Zealand, Tuhoi Maori group have been in dialogue and in negotiation with the settler government for years and years in order to have sovereignty returned over their land, which is called Te Urewera. And the negotiation was eventually successful, and Te Urewera became a legal person. And this is hailed as a fantastic thing, and it is in lots of ways. On the other hand, if you turn the tables, what it means is that the settler government of New Zealand would rather let Te Urewera own itself than give it to Tuhoi, right? So this construct of the legal person is a translation of Tuhoi ontology that ignores the not only. Te Urewera is not only a legal person, it's something else as well, always. And the progressive government of New Zealand, it made an incredible step, but from an ontological point of view, right, it's still an assimilation. It's still saying, well, this is language that we can deal with, but we cannot deal with the idea of giving sovereignty for you to engage politically with the not only. And I think that in a lot of ways that's I think you describe in the struggles in Peru as well, and with including with the allies of the indigenous groups.
Can I say something very briefly that
Please.
just occurred to me? Politics is agonistic, you said, and I think it has to be constantly agonistic. There's no settlement to politics. And I'm thinking that settlement comes from settler. So unsettled politics, the politics from the non-settler, the politics, modern politics as the politics of the settler, and we want to unsettle politics, meaning a constant agonism and alliances that need, and that's why to me uncommons is also a good word, because uncommons proposes a politics towards the commons in which the commons knows that it's underpinned by the uncommons. So there's no settlement of the commons. Anyway, so unsettlement, it just occurred to me as you were talking about politics and the treaty, and I thought settler politics, and then I thought unsettler politics.
But would you think, when I speculate, I am more optimist than reasonable.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that, well, I understood I think I understood a point about our categories and their universality. I can see you are human, you are human, all of you are human, and even if I don't meet you, I can define you. So that, indeed, in pragmatic terms, it cannot be shed away because we would dislike, we would hate people who say this is not a human or a subhuman, or there is something strong in the equality and there is something strong in the universal environmental causes who make people allied of the Runa. But my optimism is that they do not need to be prisoner of this universality. It could be a pragmatic use, so that unsettling could be epidemic. We could know that meeting, encountering other people with other obligations and all that, we will be unsettled. And the very unsettlement would mean that we have met their force, their singular force, what makes them resist, what makes them the allies. So the alliances would be indeed understood as partial connection, because the alliances is between forces, and the force of the Runa cannot be separated from the Ayu. So they would not be able to define the Ayu, but they would respect it as a force which is the ally in a common struggle against the occupant. So it seems to me that what you do is indeed slowing down, unsettling, and giving to this unsettlement the power to produce more interesting alliance, who know that the common cause is a word which partially connect them. But they come with, just there stop. I love the neo-pagan witch Starhawk. And when she once wrote that to her, to tell about herself as a witch was a way to ground in something which is not an history, but really an active memory, that of the persecution of the witches. But it was also because an old Indian lady, she was coming as a good ally, progressist ally, for the rights of American indigenous people. But she said, the old lady told her, "You are very nice to come and help you. Where are you coming from?" And, well, she said, "I cannot say I can come from anywhere because I serve justice wherever there is an injustice." No, she has to ground herself in something which would make it which would make her answer worthy in the eyes of the old Indian lady, because justice, someone who brings justice, just coming anywhere from anywhere, it's not a good alliance. I have to come with my obligation to fight, and not universal. There are no universal obligations.
What I like about your question, just a tiny bit, Mihnea, and then because I want you to tell me what you think. What I like, that's a phrase that I like from you and I always use, to give something the power to. That's very empowering because you choose what to give the power to. So give the unsettlement the power to produce, you didn't say more powerful alliances. And that's exactly it. You said more interesting alliances, more alliances that may produce more, or I don't know, more interesting, more interest, like the alliances that appeal to most. But in that appealing to most, there's also conflict and there's an unsettlement, is what I mean. And unsettlement doesn't mean that it shouldn't be. Yes, unsettlement can be interesting because then it broadens, shrinks, does move, is alive. The alliance is alive and it opens to more than what they are. And that's what that not only does, that it opens to more than what is at the moment. So it's very pragmatic in that sense because it's always alert to what will come.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I could add to that, but time flies when you're having fun, so we can't continue.
Yes.
I'm going to have to unfortunately stop that and pass it to Hudele for questions that we may have either from the public here or from the online chat, so we open up a bit more.
I think the questions in the chat have already been answered in the meantime, but I'm looking to the people here in the audience. If there's, maybe we have time for one question, because I will have a look.
Can you stay another hour?
We still have, if there's no questions, I think we can round up and move to the performance.
Marisol, I was very happy to listen to you.
I was super happy. I have to thank everybody for the gift of being with you.
Thank you.
Because as I said, you are one of my 3 favorite witches. And the others 2 are Marilyn Strathern and Donna Haraway. So
I am honored.
That's a proper group of witches. Thank you so much, Magisol. This was absolutely amazing. As far as I'm concerned, Christmas came early this year. And now I want to move towards a different side of this event, and another way of getting us out of our heads. In order to help us do that, Mandrill Kin, a Brussels-based performance and musical artist, will present a way of thinking through the auditory and visual senses, a synesthetic thought. Mandrill Kin will perform his piece Anamorphosis, which means the distorted projection of an image, or in this case also sound, such that it requires switching perspective in order to experience it as a recognizable image. His work teases us to find a footing in a continual process of change, perhaps suggesting that it is impossible, but crucial at the same time. This piece is part of his bigger project Anthropocene, a reflection on the refraction of loss within digitally driven art. It challenges our assumptions about identity, human and non-human creatures, plants, landscapes, soundscapes. Surprisingly and highly originally, he shows the role that algorithms may play in thinking the new era anew. Mandrill?
y a différentes manières de voir que l'on peut organiser de façon contrastive. C'est-à-dire, par exemple, ce qui est important dans ce que j'ai appelé l'animisme, cette façon de percevoir les choses et de les systématiser que j'ai découverte chez les Achuar et qui est très commune en Amazonie, dans d'autres parties du monde. Ce qui importe, c'est la commutation entre l'intériorité et la dimension physique. C'est-à-dire de faire voir que l'on peut changer de perspective en examinant un être du point de vue de ce que l'on pense être sa subjectivité, son âme, qui est souvent représentée à la manière d'un visage humain, et puis les caractéristiques physiques et corporelles. Et donc tous les dispositifs qui permettent cette commutation sont employés, dans les masques notamment. C'est quelque chose qui n'est pas vraiment important pour la figuration que j'appellerais naturaliste, celle qui émerge en Europe à partir du XVe siècle, qui est au contraire attachée à figurer la peinture de l'âme, la limitation de la nature, etc.
thank you once again, everyone, and have a fantastic evening.